Greetings, VFI News supporters and anyone else watching this video. Welcome back once again to VFI News. The big news, though, in Israel this week is not in Israel, it's in Iran. The Ayatollahs are warning that they are working around the clock to be able to launch 2,000 ballistic missiles at Israel a day in a future war, and also warning that they're running out of water in Tehran. Meanwhile, Hezbollah in Lebanon is rearming at a furious pace in an effort to get ready for this future war that Iran seems to think is coming. And more remains of slain hostages have been returned to Israel by Hamas in the Gaza Strip. All that and much more is just ahead on this week's edition of VFI News from Israel. Well, friends, we had another amazing week in Israel with the return of the remains of a soldier, Hadar Goldin, who had been held in Gaza for 11 years. We also watched with alarm as Zoran Mamdani won the race to become the next mayor of New York City, and there were many developments regarding events in the Gaza Strip. But first, I need to tell you about what's going on in Iran, because with all due respect to those other stories, the developments in Iran, and to a lesser extent Lebanon, have the potential to be catastrophically consequential in the very near future. The conduct of the Ayatollah regime, which rules Iran, is utterly illogical and inexplicable when viewed through a natural lens. It reminds me so much of the conduct of the Nazi regime in Germany in the winter of 1944, when the Western Allies were relentlessly advancing towards Berlin from the west and also coming up through Italy from the south, while the Red Army steamrolled towards Berlin from the east. Now, many German cities were being bombed around the clock, and there was no hope that Germany could still win the war. But there was a chance to make a separate peace with the Western Allies that would have allowed Germany to avoid being invaded by the Soviets and completely destroyed. If the Nazi high command had taken that option, history would have taken a very different path, and much death and destruction in Europe could have been avoided. But instead, the Nazis threw everything they had into massacring as many Jewish people as they could. They had hundreds of thousands of Jewish people packed into concentration camps, mostly in Poland, and up until the day the Red Army arrived in these camps, they were busy herding these people into the gas chambers. They also packed many of them onto rail cars and moved them west into Germany so they could continue executing them there in areas that were still under their control. And by the way, 25% of my greater family were all killed in the concentration camps in Europe. Some historians have calculated that if the Nazis had thrown all the resources they expended on murdering Jews into the battle against the Red Army, they could have delayed their arrival in Berlin by up to 6 weeks. That would have allowed the British and Americans to get there first, sparing the city from being raped by the Soviets and sparing decades of hardship and problems that resulted from the Soviet occupation of Eastern Germany. There are also some historical records indicating that the Nazi high command realized this at the time, knew exactly what they were risking by continuing with their policy of prioritizing the murder of Jews, and they went ahead with it anyway. I gave you that rather long history lesson for a reason, because I want you to understand the phenomenon we're seeing right now today in the Middle East, especially Iran. Iran's environmental crisis has escalated in recent days to a point where President Masoud Pezeshkian has warned that if it does not rain soon, the capital city of Tehran will have to be evacuated of most of its residents. To put that in perspective, Tehran itself has almost 10 million residents, and it is in the center of a region with almost 15 million residents. Almost 40% of Iran's economy is centered in this region, and if the government has to evacuate it, it will cost them tens of billions of dollars that they can't afford to lose. Another commodity that Iran is running low on is electricity. Hydroelectric dams account for a large percentage of Iran's electricity production, and most of the country's dams are almost empty, which means they're not able to provide water, and they're also not able to produce electricity. This is the very definition of an existential crisis for the regime. And what are they doing in response to it? They're making bellicose threats about what they're going to do to Israel. Iranian officials declared this week that the factories which produce ballistic missiles are working around the clock, and they hope to soon have enough weapons to be able to launch 2,000 ballistic missiles every single day at Israel in a future war, which they say is inevitable. If these lunatics are saying a future war with Israel is inevitable, it's not because Israel wants another war with Iran. Quite the opposite. We'd be very happy to help the Iranian people deal with the terrible drought and other environmental problems they're facing if the regime would just get over its obsession with us and start actually governing their country. The UN and the international community spend a lot of their time and resources trying to force Israel to do things which they say are for our own very good. Well, I wish they would take a break from all that for once and try to convince the Ayatollah regime in Iran to do some of the things that really would be good for their own good. Israel's Air Force did great damage to Iran's ballistic missile and nuclear facilities during the 12-day war in June, including the United States Air Force. But according to the latest intelligence estimates, the damage was not as great as initially believed. Even so, they will need to do a great deal of repair work before these production facilities are even theoretically capable of working around the clock, as the regime says they already are. Even once they get back in high gear, it will take them many years to build up an arsenal that would allow them to even fire as many missiles at Israel as they did back in June, much less this number of 2,000 a day that they're threatening. I have no doubt that while they're trying to build this arsenal up, Israel's intelligence agencies will be doing everything they can to slow them down. Maybe beepers, walkie-talkies, who knows? And in the past, we've seen how effective these intelligence agencies can be. As a footnote to all this, the production of ballistic missiles requires a lot of water and electricity, both of which, as I said before, are in short supply in Iran these days. For all of these reasons, I think Israelis shouldn't panic about these stupid threats the Ayatollahs are making about hitting us with 2,000 missiles a day. However, there's something else they're doing which we do need to be concerned about. Hezbollah, the Shiite terror militia in Lebanon, is making steady progress in its efforts to rearm, organize, and prepare for another round of confrontation with Israel. The IRGC in Iran has sent them around $1 billion in the last year, smuggled through various money changers and other routes. They've also sent them thousands of short-range rockets, which has brought Hezbollah's arsenal back up to around one-third of what they had prior to the outbreak of the Swords of Iron War. Israel has done its best to continue hitting Hezbollah operatives and equipment it observes moving around out in the open. The Air Force has carried out almost daily strikes for months now, and this past week there has been an unusually heavy wave of strikes in several Shiite villages in the south of the country. Secondary explosions were observed following many of these strikes, indicating the presence of ammunition that Hezbollah had placed in these villages for future use in attacks against Israel. Several tunnels, bunkers, and weapons storage depots have also been discovered and demolished south of the Litani River by the Lebanese National Army, who are doing the best they can. And bless their hearts, and please pray for these guys. And don't forget to pray for the Christians throughout Lebanon. Now, they've got an impossible job to do, and they don't have enough of any of the things they need to do it, but they're trying. President Trump has told the internationally recognized government of Lebanon that this isn't good enough, and he expects them to step up and disarm Hezbollah. Amen to that. But it's painfully obvious to everyone by now that this just isn't possible, and so the IDF and possibly American and French forces might soon be deployed in Lebanon to enforce UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which has Hezbollah's disarmament as one of its clauses. Iran has also begun sending large quantities of weapons, ammunition, and money to the Badr Brigades, a Shiite militia which plays a similar role in Iraq that Hezbollah plays in Lebanon. Now the IRGC has declared that this is also part of their plan to build a large invasion force that they want to send into Israel, possibly through Jordan and or Syria. This plan has even more holes in it than their plan to build enough missiles to send 2,000 a day at us. But still, it's yet another indication that this evil, wicked, satanic, and utterly insane regime in Tehran is filled with demonically inspired rage and hate for Israel, and they're not going to stop. They're going to keep right on devoting all their resources to try and wipe us out, even while their capital city runs out of water and electricity, even as their economy crumbles and their population starves. They've got the same spiritual disease that the Nazis had in Germany in the winter of 1944, although it's got some cosmetic differences. So with all this in mind, I'm asking you to join me in praying for the people of Iran, especially the underground evangelical church there. As many others have pointed out, this is a spiritual war before it's a kinetic or political war. So we need to be praying into these battles in the spiritual realm. If you want to do also something in the natural realm, I invite you to watch this short video about ways that Vision for Israel is supporting Israel in this time of crisis by placing more and more bomb safety shelters and supporting emergency first response teams. The need is still great despite the ceasefire in Gaza, which we'll talk about more in a moment. But first, please watch this video, Vision for Israel. After October 7th, 2023, which was considered the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, security teams were devastated along the southern border of Israel. From October 8th onwards, also Hezbollah in Lebanon, a terror group, also attacked in the northern part of Israel. Security teams turned to Vision for Israel for extra aid and help, and many of the items that we provided were ceramic vests for security teams to avoid bullet wounds as well as shrapnel wounds. We also needed to provide proper helmets. Most of these security teams had outdated equipment that hadn't been replaced in decades. In addition to that, there was a request for medic bags and defibrillators and for all sorts of medical disposables that were needed. Then as a result of these rocket attacks, also fires were erupting, and so we were requested to provide firefighting equipment and generators and protective clothing in order to put out these fires. And so Vision for Israel is very happy to come alongside the civilian security teams, the community security teams. We even bought a new police vehicle for one of the southern cities and dedicated it together with the mayor. It was in the city of Sderot, which was badly hit during the first days of the war, and the requests keep coming in, and we will continue to keep providing. Welcome back, friends. I have to just quickly mention another development on Israel's northern border, and that's the visit this past week of Syria's interim president Abu Muhammad al-Julani to the White House. Al-Julani is not such a good guy with his past. He's a former al-Qaeda operative who has loose control over an army which is dominated by Sunni jihadist elements that have already committed many atrocities against the Druze and the non-Sunni minority groups throughout Syria. It is not much of a mystery what these guys would do to the Jewish people living in Israel if they thought they could get away with it. However, as bad as the al-Julani regime in Syria is, it is a big step up from the Assad regime, which it replaced. One of the key reasons for this is the hostility to Iran and its Lebanese proxy Hezbollah. The old saying that the enemy of my enemy is my friend does not exactly apply here because al-Jilani is the enemy of Israel's enemy, but he's still not Israel's greatest friend. However, his fierce opposition to Iran and Hezbollah are an asset to Israel in this crisis, and President Trump seems to think he's also got some other things to offer. I hope that turns out to be true, and we'll be watching closely with all of you out there to see how this develops month by month. Another situation we'll be watching closely here in Israel is the emerging administration of Zohran Mamdani, the self-described democratic socialist who won the election recently to become the next mayor of New York City. This sprawling metropolis is the financial capital of the United States, and it's also home to the largest concentration of Jewish people in the world outside of Israel itself. Around 2 million Jewish people live in New York and northern New Jersey, and there are also hundreds of Israeli-owned or affiliated businesses that have operations in this region. Israeli universities have partnerships with universities in this region, and the banks that have their headquarters in New York City handle millions of transactions for American companies every year. For all these reasons, Israelis have a lot of reasons to be interested in what's going on in New York City, and the election of Zohran Mamdani has many Israelis worried. In fact, 46% of Israelis have been polled recently and said they will not travel anymore to New York City. Well, even before taking office on January 1st, he has signaled his intent to use his new position to wage economic warfare against the Jewish state by ordering the municipality of New York to withdraw its funds from banks that do business with Israeli companies. In other words, Zohran Mamdani wants New York City to join the campaign to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel. That's called the BDS movement. The banks in New York City, which, as I have said before, handle enormous volumes of transactions for these Israeli companies every year, will have a tough choice to make, because what Mamdani wants to do is not only morally reprehensible, it's also going to cost these banks a lot of money, as well as New York City. We'll have to wait and see what they decide to do, and I would imagine that there are already discussions in the boardrooms of many of these banks, as well as other corporations that have headquarters in New York, about leaving town for good. I know for a fact that a large percentage of those Jewish people I mentioned earlier who live in New York City are thinking seriously about leaving town. I've spoken to some of them, and not a few of them are looking into the possibility of making Aliyah to Israel. Bravo, it's about time. Mamdani's election as the mayor of New York, despite his unapologetic animosity towards Israel that he barely even tried to conceal during the campaign, is just the latest and loudest in a long series of wake-up calls that Jewish New Yorkers have received in recent years. Anti-Semitic attacks in the city have skyrocketed, according to the FBI, and I would add that these statistics only tell us about incidents which got reported to the police. Everyday harassment of Jewish people in New York has also increased dramatically in recent years, including verbal attacks, which usually don't get reported. This trend has also been observed in other large centers of Jewish communal life in the United States, such as Los Angeles, South Florida. Who would have believed that? Chicago and Houston. The Canadian Jewish communities, which are mostly concentrated in Toronto and Montreal, are also reporting a rise in anti-Semitic incidents that are prompting many residents to consider Aliyah to Israel. So I welcome all you Jewish people out there. Come home soon. Do I even need to mention the deteriorating situation for Jewish residents of Paris, London, Amsterdam, and Marseille? The number of Jewish people making Aliyah from those cities is also on the rise, and all of this is happening amidst Israel's attempt to recover economically from this recent war, which I said in the first half might not be quite over yet. That is why here at Vision for Israel, we are doing everything we can to bless and support Israeli families in financial distress, assist people with Aliyah, and in general support civil life here in Israel. We help everyone who needs it, including Jewish and Arab families, students, lone soldiers, Holocaust survivors, and many others. But we'd like to do a lot more with your partnership. Please watch this short video about how you can be a blessing to Israel. And don't forget to visit visionforisrael.com.
When we go out to the distributions, we just are enjoying to see the people when they come to us and they are so grateful. It's one thing to look at lists of names and all the people coming, but when we see them and when they come and when they sit there and then they meet us, we get to talk to them, we get to learn about their families and their needs beyond what we're giving them. That is the greatest expression of our faith in God and who Yeshua is for us, because if it wasn't for him being the provider for this organization, we wouldn't have what we have to give out. And the greatest of this is to give it with love. And that is our logo, that is our motto, to do it joyfully, to do it with love. We always like when we come together, the staff, make sure that when you go, you're cheering them up. It's not just the giving of the voucher, it's the giving of the spirit, to lift them up spiritually, to let them know that there are people behind them, that the support that we give is not just money, but it's much more than that. And that is our prayer, is for the spiritual and the physical restoration for our people.
We've now provided over 300,000 brand new school packs with their supplies inside for school children of all ages, but particularly the first and second grades. I just love it when we distribute and when a little child comes up and just hugs you on the leg or gives you a big hug and says thank you. And sometimes they may even have a runny nose. I think it's like one of the cutest things. It melts my heart so much. And I'm going, wow, I hope that when they grow up to be an adult and maybe they've been through the army and university and they have a profession, maybe that memory will stay with them for all those years and decades. Welcome back, friends. Now we're coming near to the end of the program, so I'll just quickly run through some of the other big headlines making news in Israel this week. IDF Lieutenant Hadar Goldin was killed in action in Gaza during the Operation Protective Edge in 2014, and his body was dragged into a Hamas tunnel. For 11 years, can you believe this? His remains were held in one of those Hamas tunnels, denying his family the dignity and closure of burying him. This past week, his remains were finally returned to Israel, and his family was at least able to have the dignified funeral they deserved. There are still 4 hostages whose remains have not yet been returned to Israel, and intelligence officials believe that the Palestinian Islamic Jihad organization has control over 2 of them, while it is unclear where the other 2 are. However, following the return of Goldin's remains, the Trump administration is urging Israel to agree to a demand by Hamas to allow around 200 of their operatives who are trapped in tunnels underneath Rafah to have safe passage back to Hamas lines. Now, this bizarre situation is made more complicated by the fact that some of these terrorists have already attacked IDF troops in Rafah, violating the ceasefire. Now, Israeli officials have said that they can surrender if they want, but they can't just walk away untouched. And most of the Israeli public supports this position. I do, certainly. The Trump administration appears to be sympathetic to Israel's concerns in this matter, but they also really want to move on to phase 2 of the ceasefire plan. Now, in this second phase, Hamas is supposed to be disarmed, and the IDF is supposed to pull back a bit from the yellow line it is currently deployed on in eastern Gaza. But Hamas has taken many steps in the almost 5 weeks since the ceasefire began, which indicate it is most certainly not preparing to disarm, much less disband. It'll be very interesting to see what happens next, but for now, we're glad to have Hadar Goldin home. And I'll say on a personal note that far more hostages have come home than I even expected. We still want the remains of those last 4 hostages, but I'm personally grateful and happy for the families and pleasantly surprised that we've gotten as many back as we have. In related news, however, Turkey, and I'm not talking about upcoming Thanksgiving, but they made a deeply unfriendly move against Israel this week by issuing arrest warrants for Prime Minister Netanyahu and 36 other senior officials on charges related to the Swords of Iron War in Gaza. This move comes at the same time as Turkey is insisting on contributing troops to the International Stabilization Force, which is another aspect of Phase 2 of the ceasefire plan. Turkey has actually hinted at plans to send several thousand soldiers to Gaza to be part of this plan, and Israel is deeply suspicious of their intentions. I certainly am. The AKP party that President Erdogan leads is a franchise of the Muslim Brotherhood, just as Hamas is. With Turkish forces deployed in northern Syria, not far from Israel's northern border, it would be very foolish for Israel to allow large Turkish forces to be deployed on the southern border with Gaza. I've said many times in this and other venues that the scenario prophesied about in Ezekiel 38 to 39 is beginning to come into focus, and I urge you to go read those chapters as soon as you finish watching this video and start praying about what you read there. Another story making headlines this past week is an apparent attempt by Iran to assassinate the Israeli ambassador to Mexico. Mexican police broke up the plot, but Iranian officials are saying it's an all-Israeli-inspired hoax. Of course, that's what they always say when they get caught red-handed. It's important to point out in this context that the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and their favorite proxy, Hezbollah, have extensive ties to the narcotics trafficking syndicates in Latin America. This has been a big problem for many years, and it is a baffling mystery to me why Israel doesn't talk more about it. Our most dangerous enemy is making hundreds of millions of dollars a month selling poison to Americans and Europeans, also causing immense suffering to people all over the Western Hemisphere. This should be a massive public relations problem for Iran and Hezbollah, but it's not, because it gets hardly any attention from the major Western media outlets, particularly CNN and other legacy media outlets. Now moving on, the top leadership of the BBC was forced to resign this past week following a story published in The Telegraph, a leading British news portal, which exposed systematic anti-Israel bias at the BBC, as well as biased coverage of the Trump administration in the United States. Now, my brief comment on this is that it's nice, but it's also too little too late, and I doubt it'll do too much good going forward. However, I'm happy about the results for now. The BBC has been strongly biased against Israel for a very long time, decades, and at this point it's become part of the culture there. It's not a bug in their system, it's a feature, and it has been a spillover effect into several other news agencies and media outlets all over the English-speaking world and beyond. The resignations of a few senior administrators at this juncture are not going to go very far towards addressing these problems, and they're certainly not going to undo any of the enormous amounts of damage to Israel that the biased reporting of the BBC has done over the decades, particularly over the last 2.5 years with the Swords of Iron War. Now, we're out of time this week's report, but I want to continue the tradition of ending these reports with some good news, so here it is. The S&P ratings agency upgraded Israel's credit rating this past week from negative to stable. Very good, my friends. This will ease some of the government's most urgent financial issues, and it will also give a break to ordinary Israelis like myself, many of whom have gone into debt to manage the last 2 years of economic hardship because of this war. So thank you, S&P. Keep doing it. With that, I'm Barry Segal, and this has been another episode of VFI News from Israel. God bless you all, and shalom, shalom.